There is a quiet moment in every crowded room when you feel the shift. The air thickens with unspoken anxieties, the weight of other people's days settling in your chest like stones. You look around and see faces carrying their private storms, and something in you opens, a porousness that drinks in their sadness, their stress, their silent desperation. This is the beginning of being an emotional sponge. That subtle opening where empathy becomes not just feeling with someone, but feeling for them so completely that their emotions become your own. You carry the tension in your shoulders, the grief in your stomach, the anxiety humming in your veins. At first, it feels like connection, this deep attunement to the emotional weather of those around you. But slowly, imperceptibly, the weight accumulates. You find yourself exhausted after social gatherings, needing hours of solitude to recover from conversations that others seem to leave behind easily. Your own emotions become difficult to distinguish from the emotional residue you've collected. The line between compassion and self-abandonment begins to blur. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with this sensitivity. You stand in rooms full of people, yet feel utterly alone with the emotional burden you carry. The very quality that makes you deeply present for others, this capacity to absorb, to feel, to understand, becomes the thing that isolates you in your own saturated heart. What happens when the gift of feeling deeply becomes a burden too heavy to bear? When does the capacity for empathy cross that invisible threshold into emotional exhaustion? And how do we learn to feel without drowning in what we feel? The emotional sponge exists in the liminal space between empathy and enmeshment. Psychology offers us frameworks to understand this delicate balance, the difference between healthy emotional resonance and the kind of absorption that depletes the self. At its core, this is about emotional regulation, our ability to process, manage, and respond to emotional experiences. For the emotional sponge, regulation becomes complicated because the boundaries between self and other become porous. You don't just witness someone's pain, you absorb it, process it, carry it as if it were your own. Attachment theory helps us understand how this pattern often begins in childhood. Many emotional sponges learned early that their worth was tied to their ability to soothe others, to anticipate needs, to be the calm in someone else's storm. This conditioning creates neural pathways that equate caregiving with identity. I feel, therefore, I am needed. The paradox of the emotional sponge is that what begins as a beautiful capacity for connection becomes a source of profound isolation. You become so attuned to others' emotional states that you lose touch with your own. The very sensitivity that allows you to comfort others makes it difficult to comfort yourself. Polyvagal theory gives us the language of the nervous system, how our bodies respond to emotional stimuli. For the sponge, the nervous system remains in a state of heightened alert, constantly scanning for emotional cues, ready to absorb and respond. This chronic state of attunement is exhausting, like holding a muscle tense for hours without realizing it. The emotional sponge lives in the tension between two truths: that feeling deeply is both a gift and a burden. That connection requires both openness and protection. This is the psychological landscape we must navigate, learning to feel without being flooded, to care without being consumed. To understand the emotional sponge, we must look at the neuroscience of empathy itself. Mirror neurons, those specialized brain cells that fire both when we perform an action and when we see someone else perform it, create the biological foundation for emotional resonance. For some, this system is particularly sensitive, creating almost immediate emotional contagion. But there's another layer. Emotional sponges often have what psychologists call porous boundaries. Unlike healthy empathy, which maintains a clear sense of self while understanding another's experience, porous boundaries allow emotional states to flow across the self. Others divide without filtration. The result is emotional flooding, taking on more than the nervous system can process. Childhood conditioning plays a crucial role here. Many emotional sponges grew up in environments where they learned to be hypervigilant to emotional cues. Perhaps a parent's mood determined the household atmosphere, or their emotional stability depended on managing others' feelings. This creates what attachment theorists call role reversal. The child becomes the emotional caretaker, learning to prioritize others' needs over their own. The cost of constant absorption is profound. Research on emotional labor shows that chronic empathy without boundaries leads to burnout, compassion fatigue, and what psychologists call empathic distress, the negative emotional state that arises from witnessing suffering without adequate coping mechanisms. The sponge becomes saturated, unable to process more emotional information, yet often feeling compelled to continue absorbing. There's also the phenomenon of emotional contagion cascades, where absorbing one person's stress makes you more likely to absorb others, creating a compounding effect. You leave one stressful interaction only to enter another, carrying the residue of both. The nervous system never gets the reset it needs. The emotional sponge often develops what cognitive therapists call thought-action fusion, the belief that feeling someone's pain obligates you to fix it. This creates a cycle of over-responsibility where you carry not just the emotion itself, but the weight of needing to resolve it. The boundary between witness and participant dissolves. Yet there's wisdom in this sensitivity too. Emotional sponges often possess remarkable intuition, deep compassion, and the ability to create spaces where others feel truly seen. The challenge isn't to eliminate this capacity, but to learn how to channel it without being overwhelmed by it. The exploration leads us to a crucial distinction: the difference between empathy as absorption and empathy as witness. One drowns you in the experience, the other allows you to stand beside it, offering presence without losing yourself. There comes a moment of quiet recognition when the emotional sponge realizes the cost of constant absorption. It might happen during a particularly draining week, or in the stillness after helping someone through a crisis, when you notice the emptiness where your own emotions should be. This is the turning point. The moment when insight becomes compassion, first for yourself. You begin to understand that the exhaustion isn't a personal failing, but the natural consequence of a system pushed beyond its capacity. The very sensitivity that makes you caring has been operating without the necessary filters. Learning to set boundaries becomes an act of self-compassion rather than selfishness. You start to recognize that saying, "This is not mine to carry," isn't rejection, but respect for both yourself and the other person's capacity to handle their own emotions. The boundary isn't a wall, it's a membrane that allows connection while maintaining integrity. There's a profound emotional weight in learning to distinguish between "I feel with you" and "I feel for you so completely that I lose myself." This distinction requires what psychologists call mentalization, the ability to understand that others have separate minds with separate experiences. It's the recognition that you can care deeply without taking responsibility for fixing everything. The reflection phase often brings up grief for all the times you carried burdens that weren't yours, for the energy spent absorbing emotions you couldn't change, for the relationships where your empathy became enabling rather than empowering. This grief isn't regret. It's the necessary mourning of patterns that no longer serve you. As you practice this new way of being with emotions, something shifts internally. The nervous system learns that it's safe to witness without absorbing. The mirror neurons still fire, but now there's space between the feeling and the identification with it. You become like someone standing by the ocean, feeling the waves without being swept away by them. This is where true emotional intelligence develops, not in feeling less, but in learning how to feel with wisdom. The emotional sponge doesn't stop being sensitive. It learns how to be selectively permeable, allowing in what nourishes while filtering out what depletes. The resolution for the emotional sponge isn't about building walls, but about learning the art of selective permeability. It's understanding that true empathy requires both openness and protection. The wisdom to know what to let in and what to let pass through. Imagine the sponge learning to wring itself out periodically, to release the accumulated emotional residue. This isn't rejection of feeling, but respect for the container that holds it. The sponge remains porous, capable of deep absorption, but now with the awareness of its own capacity and the right to empty itself when full. There's a quiet dignity in this transformation. The emotional sponge discovers that boundaries aren't barriers to connection, but the very structures that make sustainable connection possible. Like the banks of a river that give the water direction and flow, boundaries give empathy its form and purpose. The resolution brings a new understanding of compassion, one that includes compassion for the self. You learn that you cannot pour from an empty cup, that your capacity to care for others depends on your ability to care for yourself. This isn't selfishness, it's ecological wisdom, understanding that every system has limits that must be respected. The emotional sponge doesn't stop feeling deeply. Instead, it learns to feel with intention rather than reflex. The sensitivity remains, but now it's accompanied by discernment, the ability to choose when to absorb and when to witness, when to engage and when to preserve energy. In the end, the journey of the emotional sponge is about finding balance between two essential human needs, the need for connection and the need for self-preservation. It's learning that true empathy isn't about losing yourself in others' experiences, but about bringing your whole self to the connection. The sponge that has learned its own rhythm understands that absorption and release are part of the same cycle. It knows when to drink deeply and when to breathe, when to hold and when to let go. And in this wisdom, it discovers that the deepest connections happen not when we disappear into others, but when we meet them from the solid ground of our own being.